Out of respect for people's time, I would really like to start the presentation. So I'm just going to begin to share with you. I'm Phillipa Bayley. My role is as an independent consultant with both the International Climate Politics Hub and a group of consultants called Campaign Collective. And I'm a facilitator and an engagement practitioner working to build bridges between different communities and to shift our climate conversation in a positive direction. And my partners on this project are Paula Alvarado. Paula, I don't know if you want to put your camera on and just say hello. Oh, there she is. And Paula is going to be monitoring some of the questions and answers and sharing information with you. We also work with Lina Salas, and the project is supported by CLUA and particularly the Food, Nature, Climate Dialogue, Julia Zanoli and Ana Alvarado. These briefings organized by GroundWork are a collaboration between the ICPH, the International Climate Politics Hub, the Food, Nature, Climate Dialogue, Seeds for Change, and Tinta. And Tinta, thank you to all of the interpreters today and to the technical team who are running the webinar. This project is about developing and delivering policy briefings for Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant communities, using the latest policy intelligence from the International Climate Politics Hub. And our aim is to align that political intelligence with the priorities of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So we make online briefings and materials for sharing, like we've developed for today's call, around the key climate topics and events. So obviously now we're coming up quite close to COP30 in November, and we'll be doing a series of briefings over the next few weeks covering topics like transition minerals, artificial intelligence and Indigenous rights, and also a briefing specifically focused on the negotiations at COP30 just before it kicks off. In terms of what we're going to cover today, so this is about the changing funding landscape for Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant communities. I'll make a little bit of an introduction about what is actually changing in this landscape, and I'll sketch out the broader landscape of climate and nature finance. We're delighted to have with us today Deborah Sánchez from Clarify, and Deborah and I will be in conversation about Clarify's work and some of the other work that is elevating Indigenous peoples' priorities and streams of funding in the run-up to COP30. We'll then talk about some of these specific routes to funding. So what actually are the programs and funds that are available and specifically directed towards Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant communities? And finally, we'll talk about finance at COP30. So how will some of these issues and topics turn up at COP30 in Belém? And we'll finish with some more questions and answers. So it doesn't need saying really, but the need for climate and nature finance is huge. We have locked ourselves into an economic model that is based around extractive industries. And we know that not only through the pollution that this creates, but also the destruction of life, that continuing in this way threatens all life on the planet. But transitioning away from that means changing our energy, our transport, our built environment, our industry, and the way that we use and conserve land. And that's a massive, massive challenge. So that huge infrastructural shift is the huge challenge that is going to cost a lot of money. We know that supporting nature and biodiversity is one of the most effective ways to mitigate climate change, but this area is particularly underfunded in terms of climate and nature finance. So if you can move on, Axel, in terms of the amounts of money that we're talking about, just to give that big picture perspective, last year at COP29 was a series of negotiations called the NCQG, the new collective quantified goal on finance. And in that, what developed countries agreed is that by 2035, they would provide $300 billion per year to support developing countries. This year at COP30, so bigger than the NCQG, is something called the Baku to Belém roadmap, because $300 billion is not enough. And actually that agreement caused a lot of, not only was it very, very difficult to get to and very much at the last minute, but many developing nations felt that it was an insulting figure, that there was no way that with that amount of money they could transition their economies. So the Baku to Belém roadmap is saying, okay, actually what we need is $1.3 trillion per year by 2035 from all the different sources of finance in the world. But if you ask some of the independent think tanks that work on this stuff, they say the actual amount of money that we need to effect that huge transition that I was talking about is something like $8 trillion per year. So these are enormous quantities of money. And there are deep concerns that countries will not be able to mobilize these kinds of amounts. And I would say this is the main barrier at the moment to more ambitious climate action, and particularly for developing countries that don't have the resources to make this transition, to make the energy transition. They're saying, how can we have ambitious plans when there isn't the money on the table to pay for them? Next slide, please, Axel. So there is money in the world. There's plenty of money in the world, but the way that it's flowing right now is not supporting nature and climate goals. So there's an agenda called International Financial Institution Reform that looks at how can we change the flows and the ways that money moves around the world. So that's looking at things like tax reform. It's looking at the harmful subsidies that we currently are putting into the industries that are harming our environment. It's looking at increasing the amount of lending that the multilateral development banks can lend, and changing the terms of that lending so that they're not, they don't discriminate so much against developing countries. There are also moves to change, to restructure debt and maybe to write off some debt, and to think about the policies and procedures that govern the way money moves to make them more transparent, fairer, and more aligned with climate and nature goals. So I'm talking about this more to give an overall picture of international climate finance, but this money is not specifically targeted towards Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant communities. But if we can put more money towards nature positive and climate positive initiatives, then that should reduce some of the pressures and the forces that are making life extremely difficult for those communities. So ecological destruction and infringement of land and rights. At this point, I think it's important just to make a distinction between finance, which is largely based around debt, so that's largely lending people money, versus funding, which is money in the bank that you get that you don't have to pay back. And we're really going to be talking about funding for Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant populations. So please skip forward, Axel, and another slide, please. So historically, of that big picture of finance that I just talked about, less than 1% of climate and nature finance has reached Indigenous peoples and local communities. And even less of that, maybe 1/5 of that, has gone directly to those communities. So that's a tiny fraction of all those flows that we just talked about that has actually reached people on the ground. And next slide, please. Often those funds are indirect, they don't go directly to communities, they're short term, they're unpredictable, and they're not aligned with Indigenous peoples and local communities' self-determined priorities. So it's sort of money that lands maybe some years, maybe not in other years, and doesn't necessarily align with the priorities of communities on the ground. Today, what we're going to talk about are the sources of international funding that are specifically targeted towards Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant communities. And the scale of that funding in total, so if you think about that $300 billion for the NCQG, or the 1.3 trillion, or the 8 trillion, we're talking of the scale of hundreds of millions to a small few $billion annually. So it is a small proportion of the total climate and nature finance. But that's not to say that it's not important. It's really, really important. And there are reasons, next slide please, Axel, to actually feel quite positive about what is changing in this part of the funding world. So thanks to the sustained advocacy of Indigenous peoples organizations and local communities and their allies over many, many years, certainly since the 1992 Rio Conventions, this picture of funding is slowly changing. And I want to draw out 4 themes that feel really important here. So the first of those is that funders are starting to understand that land tenure is a foundation to action on climate and nature. I think that was, it's something that communities have been talking about for many years, but in Glasgow at COP26 in 2021, it was the focus of the Pledge for Tenure Rights and Forest Guardianship of Indigenous peoples. And I think that helped to change the mindset that actually without land and without secure tenure, no sustainable action is possible. And I just want to add a quote here from Juan Carlos Cintia from the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities. If you can go to the next slide, Axel. If we want to keep 1.5 degrees alive, or within reach, or to connect climate and biodiversity, all of it needs Indigenous peoples and local communities with strong tenure rights. This is how we will make COP29, he was speaking last year, and the trillions of dollars being allocated to address the climate crisis effective. So that idea that land tenure is essential for effective action. The second theme I want to draw out is the emphasis on direct finance. And this has now become a key point at all levels of discussion. So whenever a funder is thinking that they want to support Indigenous peoples and local communities, or there's a new funding structure emerging, it's not just about the money that's available, but what is the process by which money will be put into the hands of communities? And I'm sure Deborah will speak to this much more. In the picture there is an event from last year's COP about raising ambition on direct access to finance, and this is it's a message that has been coming across really clearly from communities. The third theme that I want to highlight is the growth of Indigenous-led and territorial funds. And here is an image from the Shandia Alliance, from the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, that links together many of the Indigenous and territorial funds. These are funds that are for and shaped by communities. And this is really the other side of the coin from the direct access to finance. If funders want to make sure that money really reaches communities, then Indigenous-led and territorial funds are an amazing way to do that. it's their processes, their priorities, their evaluation methodologies are in alignment with the communities that they serve and created with them. So that means that there's an inherent understanding of how money needs to move in order to be effective. And I would recommend having a look at the Shandier platform and also the Clarify platform to see more about this. The fourth theme I just want to draw out is the increasing focus on the Indigenous bioeconomy. And this is about Indigenous peoples controlling the funding that comes into their communities by becoming economic agents in a way that works for them. This week is actually the first London Indigenous Business Week. So Indigenous representatives are in London talking to funders about how they can support Indigenous socio-bioeconomy initiatives. And so the light in the darkness that I wanted to speak about today is really Indigenous peoples and local communities moving from being recipients of funding, which is often the way that people are cast in a sort of passive role that at the end of the pipe, the money comes out, to actually saying Indigenous peoples, local communities and Afro-descendant communities are becoming shapers of the funding landscape. And funders are hearing the message that people want to be involved in making this funding work for them on their terms. And that's a really powerful and important shift. On that note, I'd love to introduce Deborah Sánchez from Clarify. She's the director of the Clarify initiative, and they're right at the forefront of these issues. Just to explain, Clarify stands for the Community Land Rights and Conservation Finance Initiative. That's a long acronym, and it's led by Rights and Resources International and the Campaign for Nature. And Deborah might want to just reflect a little bit on what we've shared so far and talk a little bit about Clarify's approach. And I've got some questions for you, Deborah.
Thank you, Phillipa. Titaniamni kumibanira. I am really happy to be here. Greetings in my language in Mosquito. I'm greeting everyone from the eastern coast of Honduras, where my indigenous peoples have a territory and we make a life here, the Mosquito community. Yeah, so Philippa, very interesting to see and have our overall picture. I think just the sitting the where we are right now, just before COP in this Roma is important because we know we are living in a different world from last year. Many changes at the global level. I think just to introduce us to where we are, what happened during the negotiation in Baku, what's the roadmap to Belém, what are the things that we have to expect, what are some of the commitments that are there in the table and being negotiated. I think that's important because actually we are developing a lot of the agenda already for Belém in that like situate us in the moment that we are living right now. I think is very important, and that's what you really did in a very good way. And then also bringing back what are the thematic priorities. I think is important for us in terms of what are the topics and where we can actually advocate for changes. I really like that one message around shaping the finance landscape. I think that we have been talking about how important is the role of indigenous peoples and local community at the ecosystem level and conservation and at the climate change and everything. But I think it's important to now that message goes back to how important is our role in shaping the finance and the climate finance as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to say, Deborah, people are saying they're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. I don't know
Okay.
if you can get a little bit closer to the mic. And Axel, maybe we can take the slide down so that people can see Deborah more clearly, which also helps. Thank you so much. That's great.
I just want to make sure that everyone hears me now. Is that
I
better?
think that sounds a bit louder to me. Can't quite see in the chat.
Deborah, maybe you can speak a little bit louder because it's still hard to hear you, or maybe just closer to the microphone.
I'm getting some thumbs up. I'm getting some thumbs up, so I think that's good.
Can you hear me now? Is better now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Yes, definitely, much better. Thank you.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Could you talk a little bit about the role that Clarify has and the role that you're playing in this lead up to COP30 to help to set the agenda around finance?
Yeah, I think so from the clarified side, as you mentioned, Phillipa, we are a funding mechanism at the global level, right? We are part of this ecosystem of funding mechanism that are being led by Indigenous peoples, local community, and Afro-descendant. We have an steering committee member that is coming from the bigger Rights and Resource Initiative Coalition that is more than 200 organizations across continents. And basically the role that we are doing right now is just giving funding directly to the organizations and the communities. So far we have been we started with the piloting phase in 2022, and now we are getting to the point that we have been already drawing some lessons learned, some best practices that will really help other funding mechanisms and other donors to understand the challenges, but also the opportunities that direct access to funding really means at the real practical level. So what we have been doing so far is having around 186 projects already. Some of them, most of them, more than 100 already completed by the organization, led by the organization, where we have 6 thematic priorities, yes, because we have to have a guidelines. It's coming from our governance and from our steering committee members and from a broader consultation. But in the organization, the communities will define their self-determined priorities around where the fundings are going within that bigger framework. So that is one important step forward. So when you hear the communities actually shaping and making the decision of where and how the funds are going to be allocated, at what activities and what time. And we are in this same conversation around direct access to funding. We are also just launched basically 2 tools that will help us to listen to the organization, listen to the communities around where they want to have the funding for what. So we developed like a website where people can actually share their ideas and become part of the portfolio, right, that Clarify has. And another tool that is through WhatsApp, because we know at the community level it's more harder to get to the computer, but it's sometimes easier to get in your phone. And then we can hear from people by audio, by video, with pictures around what ideas they want to share, so we can take and we can be in active listening of the community, so we can co-create basically where the funding of Clarify should go and for what. So I think that shape on the paradigm where I am the one knowing what everyone needs and wants in these ecosystems, right? And the work that everyone is actually recognizing that the Indigenous peoples, local community, and Afro-descendant knows. I've been a steward of the territories for millennial time, and really know, and the support that we can do is more around the technical piece, is more around what they really want us to be supporting, right? So I really think that right now we are in the way that we need to just quick to be gatekeepers and start being more like a partners, right? A key partners in the process. So Clarify wants to be that key partners. We want to do as much as the organization wants in terms of where we are doing, what activities are we doing, are we having, and what role are we playing. So it depends on actually what the organization and the community is really wanted us to do.
Yeah. Amazing. I hear you turning your ears very much towards the communities. And I'm wondering, do you feel that that other funders are doing the same thing? Do you think this is the beginning of a cultural shift towards openness to those who live on the land and know what is needed?
Absolutely, Philippa. I was in the UN Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues earlier in April, and I think a lot of the funders were in a listening mode, actually. They were there listening to the events, listening to having conversation with communities, with leaders around the world. I think the same happened in London Climate Week. The same happened in Brazzaville Forum in May in Brazzaville. So I believe a lot of the funders and a lot of the people is now in that listening, learning. And I think the role that we have now is we are already been working in direct access to funding. So we need to actually bring those experiences as well and share, right? Because I think that's the role that we can do right now.
Yeah. Great. And on the other side of the coin, what are some of the issues that give you really cause for concern as we move towards COP30, as you say, in this very different world than we were even living in last year, with the withdrawal of a lot of, well, entirely US aid funding to initiatives across the world, and then pulling out of the Paris Agreement, and withdrawing funding from the multilateral system. I mean, I'm not sorry. I'm wanting to know from you, what are your sources of concern?
Yeah, it's always around everything can be done with a very good faith, but we have to be part of the process. For me, that's the main concern. So we can have funding, we can see pledges coming, we can see a lot of the very great initiatives. And I'm really grateful to seeing a lot of this initiative engaging Indigenous peoples and local community leadership from the very beginning. We didn't have that before, right? But now we see a lot of the pledges and a lot of the groups that wants to bring funding really engaging in an early stage the Indigenous peoples, local community leadership and vision, and I think that's very, very good. The other piece that I do have concern is we are being putting our part as an Indigenous peoples and local communities in Afro-Descendant. We've been constructing funding mechanism, giving the governance that it needs, developing a lot of consultation at the community level, developing the way of how guidelines, right? The way of how this funding is going to go to the ground, what communities will have access to that, developing a big pipeline of what the communities, what are the needs, what are the thematic priorities. But if we are building and constructing and having a lot of resources putting into the infrastructure that we believe is the more adequate to bring that funding directly to the ground, now we need to make funding flow through that infrastructure.
Yeah.
So for me, the main concern is to seen as that we have no capacity to do that. One, we have been demonstrated very hard that we do have capacity. Of course, this is a learning process. We will gonna learn together, right? Nothing is so perfect that will not have a learning process and a learning curve. But I think we've been demonstrating that we can do it, and we are very committed to do it. And I think that's the main concern for me, that we have been constructing and putting a lot of efforts in the governance, in process, in the infrastructure, and then that we ended up in a COP where a lot of commitment is made, but not with real implication of how much of that will go directly to the infrastructure that we are creating and developing.
Yeah, so that seems like a really good moment to bring in the renewed pledge. And I know that RRI are very involved in promoting that. We'll talk about it a little bit more in detail in the next section of the webinar. But do you want to say something about that, or about the other things that people should look out for at COP30?
Absolutely. I think the message at COP30 should be around direct access to funding, right? And actually bringing already to the table those recommendations that we already have and those lessons learned that we are already living. And yes, we are in this Pledge We Want campaign, along with Tenure Facility, If Not Then Who, and in the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, because I think jointly we know that the voices from the people in the ground is around more access to funding, more funding to continue the activities, right? The changes at the community level are so big that now we need to step in and support the communities, because the communities are being resilient and are been fighting for years. And now I think in solidarity, we need to put a step forward and support, like hand to hand to the communities in the ground.
Yeah, I hear you really calling clearly to funders, you know, put your money where your mouth is. Like, if you believe in communities and you believe that they have the answers and that they can do the action that is needed that benefits everybody around the world, then put your money where your mouth is and show that it's true. Is there any action that you want to call for from the people on today's webinar that you would love to see them take to support this agenda? You talked about calling for direct finance, but is there anything else that you would like to point out?
Yeah. I think if everyone can actually join the Pledge We Want campaign and bring your voices, I think this is a campaign that is not close to one actor or another. I think it's something that implies the life of everyone, the work of a lot of people, right? The recognition of the work, of the value of a lot of people in the ground. So I will call for everyone to join the campaign, but also to share your experience, share your wisdom with us, because I think in this world, the best we can do is in solidarity, sharing our knowledge together, so we can construct and build like a new hope, right? For me, that's that I invite everyone to join and to share.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And will you be in COP30 in Belém yourself? And where could people find you if you're going to be there?
We are planning to be there with along with colleagues from Rights and Resource Initiative, and of course I will share in my social media with contacts, with events, with things that will be available. So yes, and of course any contact information, we have a website and everything. You can reach out as well, so we can talk more, and actually I'll be happy to listen to all the wisdom that everyone has to share.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Deborah, and for being so open and responsive. And Deborah is going to stay on the call so we can come with questions at the end of the webinar. Wonderful. Thank you. And
Thank you.
we can go back to the slides. So we've shared quite a lot of information already. I want to just give a moment to pause and reflect. If you would like to share, we have a Menti site, and my colleague Paula will put the link in the chat. And maybe if there's more information that you wanted to know, or something that's new to you from today, or what's making you feel hopeful about the progress in funding flows, it would be great to hear that from you. Actually, I can put the Menti in there. Oh. Let's see. I think this is a shorter link, which might lead you more directly there. Okay. So we just move on to the next section of the webinar, which is about specific routes to funding for Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant communities. And the first one of those that I want to introduce is the Tropical Forest Forever Facility. And I'm sure you've heard people speaking about this. It has been around in the world of funding since COP28, but is only now really taking shape and will be announced at COP30 by the Brazilian government. And the real motivation for this facility, which is a new idea and a new way of funding, is how can we pay the people and the countries that preserve standing tropical forests? So the challenge has been that a tropical forest in our current economic model is worth more when it's felled than when it's standing. And that's obviously a crazy situation for communities that live in and depend on the forest, and for the ecological health of our planet more widely. So the challenge that the Brazilian government is trying to meet is to create a stable and long-term source of income for tropical forest countries and for the people that steward them. And the idea is to take an investment approach. So the Tropical Forest Forever facility would take sponsor capital largely from global north governments and from philanthropies and try and raise $25 billion. And that would give confidence to private sector investors to invest a further $100 billion in buying bonds, so long-term investments, stable investments. They take that money and they invest it in higher risk activities, many coming from emerging economies. And the interest that they gain by doing this both pays back investors and then is given out in payments to tropical forest countries at a rate of $4 per hectare. So with more than 1 billion hectares of tropical forest available across many countries, the whole fund is looking to be able to fund something like $4 billion per year. We can just go to the next. So just to see this in a graphical format, so there's money from sponsors, so from largely global north governments, that catalyzes investment from the private sector, like 4 times as much investment from the private sector. All of that money is invested in slightly higher risk activities, which generates interest. And then the interest on that money both goes back to paying the original investors. So about half of it goes back to the market investors and to the sponsors, eventually paying them off over time. The other half goes to tropical forest country governments and to forest stewards, so indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant communities. And it has been agreed that at least 20% of what is paid back would go to IPLC and AD communities. So if the total that's being paid out by the fund is $4 per hectare, indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendant communities might receive 80 cents per hectare, so 20% of that. Indigenous peoples and local communities have been an important part of shaping the guidance on the Tropical Forest Forever facility, which has now just released its 3rd concept note, and every time the structure gets stronger and the rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant communities are better recognized within the model. So as well as receiving 20% of the funds paid out, it has now been agreed that that money could go directly to communities and not through their national governments. And that's obviously really important where many communities are not in a good place of relations with their national governments, or where the national government may be one of the forces that is undermining them. And advocates have also made sure that indigenous peoples, local communities will have a permanent role in the governance of the fund. So not just in consulting to help set it up, but an ongoing role. They've also helped to ensure that there are strong investment restrictions on what the money that the investment facility holds can be invested in. So nothing that fuels deforestation can be funded. Equally, activities that support fossil fuel extraction cannot be funded through the investment facility. Consultation with communities has also helped to strengthen ideas about how to monitor deforestation. So if countries start to lose forest, they will be penalized for that, and they will receive less money or no money, depending on the levels of deforestation. They've also helped to strengthen the grievance mechanisms, which still need to be worked out fully, but that's a mechanism by which if something goes wrong with a TFFF project, how do you get that considered and remediated? How is that sorted out? And just to say, in case there's any confusion, the TFFF is not looking to replace RED Plus. So where communities are benefiting from avoiding deforestation and receiving funds through RED Plus, that will be complementary to, that will be in addition to money coming through the TFFF. It's going to take another 5 years or so until the TFFF becomes fully functional, so to 2030. So there is still time to understand how a lot of the details will work. We are going to produce a separate short written briefing about TFFF. So it would be really helpful to hear in the Menti, you know, if you've got specific questions about how this is going to work. Great. So Deborah talked about the Forest Tenure Pledge, and I'm sure many of you will remember back in 2021 when the announcement was made that 25 different governments and philanthropies were coming together to make a $1.7 billion pledge for land tenure and forest guardians from COP26 to COP30. This was really a landmark agreement. Nothing like of this scale had ever happened before. But it wasn't just about channeling more money towards forest tenure, but also, as Deborah talked about, the learning of funders, learning from each other, learning from communities about how to fund this kind of work effectively. So I think really for them, it has been a very steep learning curve over the last 4 or 5 years. To understand how to make this work well. And with that, direct funding to communities has increased steadily year on year. So in the last report, which was for 2023, about 10% of the funding was going directly to communities. And the 24-25 report will come out later this month, I think, during New York Climate Week. This pledge is now coming to an end. The money has been spent. And so it's time to talk about a new pledge. And that's what Deborah was mentioning with renewing the pledge and the pledge we want, and 2 campaigns, the pledge we want and our pledge. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the hope is, I mean, the details are still being confirmed and not all of them are yet known, but that this pledge will be launched at COP30, and it will emphasize increased direct funding to Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendants, a focus on territorial rights and on community-led conservation, and with a really transparent and accountable governance structure, so it's possible to see more detail on where the money is being spent, who the beneficiaries are, how the money is traveling to them. So I would encourage you as well, if you haven't already visited these websites, they're in the chat here, and they have got some really great resources that also tell the story of direct funding, as Deborah and I have outlined today. So connected with the pledge, if you can go to the next slide, please, Axel. Is something called the Intergovernmental Land Tenure Commitment. This is really a lot of words, but this is essentially a political agreement that complements what the pledge is trying to do. So this is getting governments to sign up to recognize a certain number of hectares of land for Indigenous and local community land tenure. So there will be a figure in this, as in a number in this commitment that governments sign up to. And the commitment is also about strengthening the governance processes around land tenure. So making sure that it's easier for communities to secure tenure, and that the processes are smoother and don't take decades to put into action. This is being, the secretariat for this is coming from the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership, which was set up in Glasgow at COP21. And this initiative is being led by Brazil, Peru and Norway, with other FCLP governments part of the commitment. And this will also be launched at COP30. Funding is not, it's not going to be like an open fund, but funds will come in to support the recognition of land tenure and the governance processes. And it will be linked to the pledge in that funds additional funds can be put into the pledge from the governments that commit to this, that sign up to this commitment. And we're hoping to do a briefing on that as well, on the Intergovernmental Land Tenure Commitment later this year as well. So please indicate if that sounds like something that you would be interested in, or where you would love to be talking to your government about those issues. Changing gear again, I wanted to mention the Cali Fund, because this is one of those funds that maybe you heard about it when it happened and when the agreements were made, and then you're wondering, what happened? What happened to that? So the Cali Fund was agreed last year at COP16, which was the Convention on Biological Diversity COP in Cali, Colombia. And the idea of this fund is that companies who benefit from the use of digital sequence information, so that means the code of all living organisms, should have to share the benefits of what they create with the countries and the stewards who've been caring for that life all along. So it's basically like a tax that comes on company profits or on their turnover. That's not completely clear yet. And of the money that comes into the fund, half of the resources are set to go to Indigenous peoples and local communities' self-identified priorities. So it's not something that says this is how you have to spend this money, but communities can themselves say, this is how we would want to spend this money to further conserve life on Earth. This was a wonderful idea in concept, but there was a lot of pushback from the industry, as you can imagine, and the language has become quite soft. It's a voluntary commitment right now, so there is an expectation that companies should do that, but there isn't a mechanism to say you have to do this. And the details are still being worked out. So there are no funds that are currently available through the Cali Fund. It's possible over time that other forms of global taxation on harmful practices could feed money into the Cali Fund. Then I just wanted to talk about two more global funds that have been around for a long time, but that have not had great engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities. And we can talk a little bit about why that is. So the first of these is the Global Environment Facility. So this is a funding facility for both the Biodiversity COP, the CBD, and for the UNFCCC, so the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it's hosted by the World Bank. They have an Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group and have had for many years. And their main engagement with Indigenous peoples has been through their small grants program. So these are grants of up to $75,000. And about 5 years ago, in 2020, they produced a publication talking about 25 years of engagement with Indigenous peoples that gives some case studies and some data on their work with Indigenous peoples. They've also more recently started something called the Inclusive Conservation Initiative, delivered with the IUCN and Conservation International. And that's still in its early stages, but they have delivered $14.5 million to self-determined conservation action. And you can read one of the first reports about that initiative on their website. So the GEF, as it's called, is a potential source to fund small projects and has quite a long history of engaging with Indigenous peoples, but mostly as beneficiaries of projects rather than as actively shaping the funding that could come towards them. The second fund that I wanted to highlight is the Green Climate Fund, the GCF. So this is actually the largest provider of international climate finance. So when we talk about those many hundreds of billions of dollars, much of that will be channeled through the Green Climate Fund. And the way that the Green Climate Fund and the GEF work is that what they call accredited entities propose projects. So those might be like the development banks. But in the case of the GCF, the tenure facility is also one of those accredited entities, and so can propose projects. They have an Indigenous peoples policy. So the Green Climate Fund has an Indigenous peoples policy, which describes how they expect accredited entities to work with Indigenous peoples. But there are significant structural barriers to making this work in practice. So there's strong guidance around things like free, prior, and informed consent, but how it plays out in practice is not always the high standard that it should be. They also have an Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group, and you can see the most recent membership as it is on their website here on the slide. I wanted to just highlight the work of Tebteba in Indonesia, in the Philippines, sorry, for their work on the Green Climate Fund. So they've really been looking at some of these structural barriers that prevent Indigenous peoples from gaining access to the Green Climate Fund in the way that they should be able to. And even though the GCF has something that they call a readiness program to help organizations get ready to prepare applications, this is not well connected to Indigenous peoples organizations at all. So what they're asking for now is what they're calling an Indigenous peoples window, which establishes mechanisms that are tailored to Indigenous contexts, allowing for flexible access to funding, culturally appropriate project design, and sustained engagement throughout project cycles, so that it's not money that just appears and then disappears. So I would really encourage you and I will put the web address in the chat now, to have a look at the Tebteba website about the GCF. Okay, so those are the routes to funding that we wanted to highlight, and it would be super interesting to know, was this information useful? Is it enough information? Do you want more information? What more would you want to know? So please do put your comments in the chat or on the Menti, as I've said, or as I've suggested. And we're just going to move on to the final section of today's webinar, and to COP30, which is coming up from the 10th to the 21st of November in Belém in the Amazon region of Brazil. So the COP30 agenda this year has many of the key elements that every COP has. It's tempting to forget that COP is an ongoing process, a year-on-year process with the intersessional meetings halfway through the year in Bonn every year. So many of these agenda items are standing and roll on every year, and the discussions advance, but the agenda is pretty well set. So these are sort of the priority areas in terms of where the Brazilian presidency is allocating the most political resource. So around mitigation, adaptation, which includes indicators, and critically funding for adaptation, which is often underfunded compared to mitigation. Means of implementation, which is another way of talking about the finance needed to make all of this happen. The just transition, which looks at issues of the workforce. How can we migrate? How can we change the jobs that people are doing to accommodate the energy transition, but also finance, and also things like transition minerals. And then items around the GST outcomes. So the GST was the global stocktake, which took place, the first global stocktake took place in Dubai 2 years ago. And that was a summary of where are we in our progress towards 1.5 degrees. And the critical paragraph of the global stocktake was around moving away from fossil fuels, increasing renewable energy, increasing energy efficiency, and halting and reversing deforestation. So the work program that takes those outcomes forward is very important. And all of these involve discussions of finance, because without finance, it's not possible to move anything forward. And so those fault lines that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, where developed countries are saying, we're struggling, our people are struggling with the cost of living, and our economies are stretched, we can't afford to pay more. And developing countries are saying, if there's no money on the table, we simply cannot make the transition, we cannot have the level of ambition that you want us to have and that we want to have. And questions around justice, of course, for the historical emissions from the global north. So all of these discussions are intertwined with questions about finance, and that makes progress really difficult. But you will hear about some important issues this year at COP that don't necessarily form part of the negotiations, but they will be high profile anyway. And one of these is the Baku to Belém roadmap, which I mentioned at the beginning, which is about how to mobilize $1.3 trillion of climate finance every year by 2035. This isn't a negotiation item. So the Baku to Belém roadmap was, it was decided that this was needed last year, but then it has been up to the Brazilian presidency to convene meetings, and they will publish a report at COP30. And the Tropical Forest Forever facility will be part of the picture of this mobilizing of massive amounts of finance. The other issue that you will certainly hear talked about, but again is not really part of the negotiations, is the nationally determined contributions. So COP30 is the deadline for all countries to submit their nationally determined contributions, which says what their carbon budgets, what their emissions targets are, and how they are going to get to those targets. So obviously, crucially, is what some of the biggest emitters in the world are doing. And we are still waiting for NDCs from the European Union, also from China and Australia. I think China and Australia may submit their NDCs around the time of the UN General Assembly coming up in New York. Importantly, the presidency has to pull together all of the NDCs to get an overall picture of, you know, how close are we to hitting the temperature goal of 1.5 degrees. And if countries don't submit their plans, or if their plans are not aligned with 1.5 degrees, it's going to be a very difficult exercise and potentially a very disappointing picture. But again, as I say, finance is intimately caught up with this, because without the finance available, then it's very difficult for countries to have the level of ambition that's needed. In terms of how you might want to get involved with COP and where these things are going to be happening, I just wanted to emphasize again that COP is more like an onion with all these different layers than it is like one event. And you'll know that when you've spent time in that environment. So the negotiations are the core of the COP, but they're by no means the only thing going on. So of course, around that is what is called the action agenda. So that is about states and non-state actors and industry coming together to push ambition forwards. That's a really important part of the discussions at COP. You've got all the pavilions and the side events, and issues like direct access to finance have been really important in and highlighted in side events, particularly by Indigenous communities. Then you've got the green zone, which is the public facing part of the COP experience. And again, because there will be huge Indigenous representation at this COP, I think the green zone will be a very lively place for some of these debates and demands to come out. There will be mass mobilizations on the streets. Again, there will be maybe something like 4,000 or 5,000 Indigenous people coming to Belém in November. So there will be moments where people gather, and not just in Belém, but also I think in Rio and in Sao Paulo, to again make their demands and their voices heard. And then there are the public and media conversations and campaigns, so that people everywhere in the world can take part in. So there are many, many layers to COP, and many different settings in which discussion and advocacy can take place. So it's important to think about where your spaces are for impact and how you can connect to others in those spaces, and not to give up if you can't be in the negotiating room. There's still so much that happens outside and beyond that. So in terms of influencing the agenda, Deborah has mentioned, and we've put in the chat, I know, the signing up to the pledge, to the renewed pledge of the pledge we want and our pledge. So you can find that these two web links here. There's a really powerful Indigenous advocacy campaign being orchestrated by Coabi and APIB in Brazil, but for Indigenous peoples across the world, called The Answer Is Us in English. A resposta somos nós, in my terrible Portuguese, apologies. And you can find more information and about how they are organizing on their website. In terms of on the ground convenings, there's the UN General Assembly coming up and New York Climate Week, both in New York in September, and that will be a place again for major announcements, both from civil society advocates, from Indigenous peoples organizations, and from national governments. And then a very interesting intersectional meeting of a lot of different campaigns is coming together at the People's Summit, right in the middle of COP. So COP runs from the 10th to the 21st of November, from the 12th to the 16th of November at the Federal University of Pará. The People's Summit will be convening, and you can find out about their agenda and the themes that they are convening people around on their website. And I just wanted to, show you, this is The Answer Is Us, the campaign that I mentioned. And we'll go into our Q&A. I can see so much conversation has been happening in the chat, and I'm sorry because I have not been able to read all of that while presenting, but if you would like to ask a question, please, me or to Deborah. So, what is the role of culture and language revitalization to respond to climate and nature needs? Wow, that's a really powerful question. I'm happy to try and answer that, and maybe Deborah would like to answer that too. Deborah, do you want to go first, and then I?
Yeah, Philippa, I think everything is interconnected, and we are really knowing around that. So I think around bringing and bridging traditional knowledge, wisdom, right, with science and with how finance is shaping, I think is the way we need to go around that, but also recognizing that there are things that we cannot monetize, right? So respecting that part also of the culture, bringing everything back to what's important at the end for the community and what's valuable. And the other part, and I see that in the question, is the safeguards around this. So if I'm sharing my knowledge, my wisdom, what there should be at the same time the responsibility from the outside to safeguard, right, this knowledge and wisdom for everyone and for the community as well. So I think it's a both ways, yes, me sharing, but also the responsibility from those receiving the wisdom and the knowledge around the safeguard that needs to be there around it, traditional knowledge around everything that is being in some ways monetized, and also it comes with not, right, any benefits for the community at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there can be a very extractive process of taking traditional knowledge from communities or asking people to respond to endless surveys or provide endless case studies for other people to use in contexts that don't benefit them. And I think that is really important. At the same time, sharing that indigenous knowledge and that traditional knowledge is so valuable. But I think, like you say, Deborah, it's all intertwined, that relationship with land, the relationship with language, the relationship with how to care for and manage nature. These things are all intertwined. And indeed, I did a project a couple of years ago that looked at words that don't exist in the English language that express something about relationship to land and nature. And the whole of the COP process, the UNFCCC, is conducted in English, and we don't realize how much we're losing from that when we don't when we only rely on English to communicate the relationship that people have with the world around them. So yeah, that's I think a very important issue, but difficult. It is the International Decade of Indigenous Languages at the moment, but it's a difficult topic to make sure that gets really highlighted. So somebody who is looking for financial support for land in India, and a question about the TFFF. Yes, so yes, so Danielle, they're raising questions about the TFFF, the risk of making these higher risk investments, so taking capital and then investing in higher risk activities, many from emerging economies. I don't have the expert knowledge to know how safely, how reliably we can forecast these kinds of things. I know that there's been a lot of modeling going on, and I know also that that people who hold large amounts of capital don't give it away easily. So they will want to be very sure that this is a good investment from their point of view. But I think there is a real risk, and obviously this is for every community to think through themselves, but that the payments will not be at the level that they are that is predicted, especially at the outset. And there is a clause, or there is the structure within the TFFF that if payments have to be reduced or even stopped, that is a possibility if the fund is not making as much money as they predicted. And of course, we have a volatility to the markets that isn't under any one person's control. So I think there is exposure, there is risk there, and it is my understanding that the safeguard is that the investment facility cannot invest in businesses that cause deforestation. But I think when you start to look at supply chains and you look at the complexity of tracing that and making sure that something really has no links to deforestation, then that is in itself a very complex thing. So I think these kinds of measures will need to be worked out, and that Indigenous people and local communities are partly there to make sure that the highest standards are upheld in the development of the TFFF. Deborah, do you want to say anything else about the TFFF?
No, I think they've been already thinking around that relationship of those communities that don't have that greater relationship with the government, and they've been thinking on an alternative of this global global entity that will actually be intermediary in that funding for some communities. So I think that's one alternative. I think they are trying to see how that's going to be shaped. So maybe Phillipa, now that we see a lot of people asking about this, it will be really interesting to have that conversation specifically on the TFFF that you are thinking about, because I think there is a lot to unpack. It's a very complex mechanism, right? Where you are and it's been creating in the co-construction phase. So I think will be important to have those alternatives to countries that some communities, they believe their relationship is not the best with their own government, right?
Yeah. And importantly, I think people also have to be able to opt out of the scheme if they don't want to be part of it. That's got to be part of the free, prior and informed consent. If there are other people on the call that would like to speak to elements of this, who maybe haven't been involved directly with the development of the guidance, please raise your hand and we'd be very happy to open the mic to you. I also see there's a question from Alberto from Peru about the participation of Indigenous peoples in the COPs. I would agree, it has definitely not been enough in previous COPs. I think Brazil is trying to turn a corner and set a new bar for Indigenous engagement with the COP. And as you all know, Minister Sonia Guajajara from the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples in Brazil is leading the People's Circle, which is one of the presidential initiatives. And part of that is to try and get more accreditation for Indigenous peoples to be part of the COP process, as well as to strengthen the Indigenous Caucus and the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform, the UNFCCC. From my understanding, what Brazil is proposing this year is that up to 500 Indigenous people will have Blue Zone accreditation from Brazil, and that other Indigenous peoples, if they're not registered entities themselves, they should talk to their country governments about being added to what is called the party overflow. So countries can take more representatives than they have on the, than they need for the negotiations. But obviously, as we've been saying, that's not straightforward for everybody to do that. And I understand that accreditations are in short supply this year. One other thing just to say about Brazil, and then, sorry, Deborah, I'll hand over to you, is Brazil have been training young Indigenous negotiators through a program called Kuntari Kutu that they've been doing, I think, over the last 6 months to a year. So these are young people coming up through in Indigenous communities who are being trained in the processes of the UNFCCC so that they can better represent their priorities and their interests of their peoples in that process. And I think that will have a long legacy, because when young people are able to engage with these processes, then that can turn into a lifetime of political action. Deborah, what would you say?
Yeah, thank you, Philippa. Maybe just switching a little bit, I see here one questions around through which items direct access to funding can actually land in Belen, right? And I think is the aim is that we actively engage in advocacy for every item of the agenda that needs finance to actually implement it, and from that finance, how much of that will go to indigenous peoples directly, Afro descendants and local community. I think that should be our aim, to actually influence everyone, every of the agenda items. And I think one important piece is that while we are seeing these great gains around seeing these pledges of these commitments extremely saying this part and this is will be accessed directly to indigenous peoples and local communities, as you mentioned, Philippa, like the larger facilities that are flowing financial funding, climate funding for the broader, right, for the broader universe, are those that we need to more actively work on developing pathways for more direct access to funding. For example, the work that the GCF is doing, right? So we need to, I mean, this work is just starting from my point of view. So even if we really are there and shape the agenda with negotiated with people there, we still have to then face the implementation piece of the work, where this funding is flowing through the same channels, right, from the same facilities, and those facilities need accreditation, and most of the infrastructure that we are creating, we are not accredited. So we need to start, I mean, is from my understanding, it's just a beginning of the work where you actually bring and start bridging and putting into the agenda the direct access to funding. That's just the starting point for a lot more action that needs to be ongoing. So it's just like, yes, what item we should influence, I guess everyone, but at the same time looking forward on the implementation piece of the work.
Absolutely. It really highlights that this is a long game of continued advocacy, you know, and that really Indigenous peoples and local communities, as I say, have been talking about some of these issues since 1992, since the beginning of the Rio Conventions. And here we are, you know, more than 30 years later, finally moving, taking some steps in those directions. So, yeah, I'm so sorry. I think we're not going to have time to answer all of the questions, but we will review carefully everything that is in the chat and in the Q&A. I do want to encourage you, if we can just go back to the final slide. There's a sort of, it's actually a sunrise picture. We would love to have your feedback on the webinar. If you can take a moment just before the call ends to go to this Google link, Google Forms link, which I will put in the chat. We are constantly trying to improve the webinars to bring more of the kind of information that is useful and actionable for you. I really appreciate your input. I can see a lot of comments about the TFFF, which I will review, and as Deborah suggests, try and distill in a written document that you can use. Again, just so that you have it, we did create not just slides for today's briefing, but also a short document which you should be able to find on our Google Drive, and I will just try. Thank you. So if you can just take a couple of minutes before the call ends to leave us your feedback. I know if you leave the call, it goes out of your head and it's hard to come back to, but it will be accessible afterwards. I just want to thank Deborah in particular. Thank you so much for spending such a chunk of time with us today. Your insights are really so valuable and brilliantly articulated. And I hope that we will continue to see, as you say, this building success and more confidence of funders to to put their money directly towards communities for the priorities that they know best. And thank you for everything that you're doing with the Clarify initiative to help make that happen.
Thank you, Philippa. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Pali.
Yeah, thank you for everyone, for all of you, for your attention and your engagement today. Thank you, Paula, for looking after the chat, and thank you to our interpreters and the behind-the-scenes team from Tinta for making this webinar accessible to so many. Thank you. Bye-bye.